To celebrate the Hall of Fame announcement, in this video I'm going to give you a rundown of the history of the Baseball Hall of Fame, how it came to be, and how it's evolved over time. There's a lot of details here, so stick with me and I'll tell you all about it. Hey everybody, thanks for joining me on my channel, Brutus on Baseball. Like I said, today's video is going to be about the history of the Baseball Hall of Fame. You may or may not be surprised to find out that the Hall of Fame has actually gone through a lot of changes over time, especially how the Veterans Committee and the Writers Ballot work together. I initially thought to put this video together, one part the Writers Ballot and how it's evolved over time, and one part the Veterans Committee and how it's evolved over time. But when I started looking through all the information and putting this together, I realized that the two halves are just so intertwined that it was impossible to tell the one story without the other. So what I decided to do is just walk through this chronologically because that's just how it made the most sense, from the time the museum was first constructed until where we find ourselves today. Before we jump in, I'm going to ask you to take a moment, hit the like button on this video, subscribe to the channel, put some comments down there. Any of these kinds of interactions help me to get my videos out there to more people, so I'd really appreciate it a lot. Okay, first let's go over the basics. The Baseball Hall of Fame is located in Cooperstown, New York. It was opened in 1939 to honor the greatest players in the history of the game of baseball, as well as a place to house a lot of game-used items, memorabilia, photos, stories. Now, Cooperstown, New York was chosen because of the long-believed myth that Abner Doubleday invented the game in Cooperstown, New York in 1839. This myth, though, was invented and promoted by the Spalding Commission in 1907. The purpose of the commission was to try to prove that the game of baseball was really truly an American pastime, and it was perpetuated throughout the 20th century as a patriotic truth. But the myth has been thoroughly debunked over time. Despite all of this, the Hall of Fame was founded by Stephen Carlton Clark in 1936. He was an avid fan of baseball and also the owner of the Otsego Hotel in Cooperstown, New York. He really wanted to help the economy of Cooperstown, especially after it was completely ravaged from the Great Depression in the 1930s. So he and the Clark Foundation really advanced this idea that Doubleday had truly invented baseball in 1839 in Cooperstown. He donated $5 million and a ton of baseball memorabilia from his personal collection to help open the museum. And it officially opened on June 12, 1939 to celebrate the centennial of baseball that was invented by Abner Doubleday. The Hall of Fame includes many exhibits, the most famous of which is the gallery, which houses all the plaques of the people that have been inducted into the Hall of Fame. Now currently, there are 341 people that have been honored with a plaque at the Baseball Hall of Fame. That includes 239 former Major League players, 37 former players from the Negro Leagues and pre-Negro Leagues, including executives, 32 that are considered executives, which includes team owners, commissioners, and pioneers of the game in general, 22 primarily inducted as managers, and 10 umpires. Now I'll go over some very general rules before we dive into the history. First of all, to be eligible, a player must have played in the major leagues or a similar league for at least 10 seasons, and they must have been retired for at least 5 years if still living, or deceased for over 6 months. Any player that has permanently been banned by Major League Baseball and cannot work in the game is also not eligible to be in the Hall of Fame. Now there's two methods of gaining entry to the Hall of Fame. The first is the Writers Ballot. This is called the Writers Ballot because the people who vote on it are from the Baseball Writers of America Association. They currently vote every year in December with the announcement in January. And the second way of making it is through a Veterans Committee. This committee has had a lot of different names throughout the years, but essentially it's to look back at the old players, pioneers, owners, managers, umpires that have long been forgotten or didn't make it through the Writers Ballot, and try to remember those players that have deserved it, but we haven't recognized yet. Under the current rules, the way that it works for a current player is that once that player's retired and been retired for 5 years, he's first considered by the Writers Ballot. He can be on that Writers Ballot for a total of 10 years, getting votes, and if he's voted in, then he gets into the Hall of Fame. But if he's not voted in by the writers after 10 years of trying, then he's kicked to the Veterans Committee and would be considered in the future under that scenario. Next up, a quick explanation of the writer's ballot and how it works. To be eligible to vote in the writer's ballot, a person must have worked in the industry covering baseball specifically for a minimum of 10 years before they become eligible. Voters remain eligible as long as they continue covering baseball in some way, shape, or form. But if somebody stops covering baseball or they retire, they still retain their eligibility for a couple of years. I believe it's 2 years right now. Currently, this amounts to somewhere between 400 to 450 voters in the writer's ballot every year. Not all players that play 10 seasons in Major League Baseball automatically make the writer's ballot. They first have to pass through a screening committee that looks at all the players that retired 5 years ago, and they select the players to put onto the ballot. Combining with players that are holdovers from previous years that weren't elected, this amounts to somewhere between 30 to 40 players each year on the writer's ballot. Under the current rules, a writer may vote for up to 10 players on each ballot, and a player has to gain 75% of the votes to be elected. So that means, let's say it had 400 votes, a player would have to get 300 of those votes to be elected into the Hall of Fame. Players receiving somewhere between 5% and 74.9% would be able to be retained into future balloting years as long as they haven't exhausted their 10-year time limit. Any player that doesn't receive at least 5% of the vote or has exhausted their 10-year time limit cannot be carried forward to next year's ballot. And any of those players falling off the writer's ballot would then be eligible to be considered by Veterans Committee in the future. Now, the Hall of Fame has a series of 9 rules on how to conduct the voting, but most of these have to do with actually the setup of the voting or how they're counted or announced. There's really only one rule that's given, providing direction to the voters on how to do their voting, and it makes it really ambiguous, which has come up in recent years as an issue. That one rule states that voting shall be based upon the player's record, playing ability, integrity, sportsmanship, character, and contributions to the teams on which the player played. In the past, this integrity rule wasn't really applied nearly as much as it is today. And that's become a huge problem in the last decade, with the players entering the ballot that played primarily in the steroid era. Okay, let's move on and talk about the voting history, how it's all played out over time. And this is where I talked about that the Veterans Committee and the writer's ballot have been very intertwined. The first ballot was actually held in 1936, before the Hall of Fame opened. In that first ballot in 1936, all players were actually eligible, even active ones. There was a group of people that had history in the game that were asked to vote on that. And out of that vote, only 5 players were elected with over 75%. They're the big names of that time, obviously. Babe Ruth, Ty Cobb, Honus Wagner, Christy Matheson, and Walter Johnson. In that first year, voters were asked to vote for 10 players that they thought were the most deserving to be in the Hall of Fame. That's how we got those 5 players to start with. But the thinking at that time was that the Hall of Fame would be opening in 3 years, and they really wanted to have a big class available to induct in that first year upon opening. And so they put a special committee together at that time, composed of players and managers and owners that had been alive in the 1800s and seen baseball from that time, to try to bring in players from the pioneer era of the game when it was first being created. They first met in 1936, but no one was voted in because there seemed to be a lot of confusion about how that process worked, who to vote for and who was eligible. There wasn't actually a list provided. There were some suggestions and people could write in whoever they wanted, but a lot of people didn't understand that. The next year in 1937, a smaller version of that committee met again. That's when they elected 5 former executives from the 1800s, including George Wright, one of the fathers of the game, Connie Mack, and John McGraw. Both the annual balloting process and this committee that was put together both happened through 1937, 1938, and into 1939, leading up to opening a Hall of Fame. The writer's ballot from that time continued to elect players from the 1900s, while the Veterans Committee was responsible for recognizing players, executives, and managers from the 1800s. And by the time the Hall of Fame opened, they had a pretty good class to bring in. There was also a special election held in 1939 outside of the typical writer's ballot process. And it was held in the winter meetings in 1939 specifically to elect Lou Gehrig to the Hall of Fame. It was known at that time that he was terminally ill, and they wanted to induct him while he was still alive. At that time, there were still no rules saying that you had to wait until you retired to be elected. So Gehrig waltzed right in very easily, of course. With the opening of the Hall of Fame in 1939, there were 13 players and 7 executives and managers ready to be inducted. But it was noticed that year that there were no players from the 19th century that had been chosen by the Veterans Committee, only executives or pioneers. Because of that, the Hall of Fame set up very quickly what they called the Old Timers Committee. And their purpose was to look back at the 19th century baseball players and pick some players immediately to be inducted that year into the Hall of Fame before it was too late. They quickly picked guys like Cap Anson, Buck Ewing, Charles Comiskey, and Albert Spaulding to be included in that class in 1939. As a result of the opening of the museum in 1939, and this huge class that included people elected from 1936 up to 1939, there was a pause given to the voting process, and the Baseball Writers Association decided that they would vote on players only every 3 years going forward. So there was no vote in 1940 or 41, and the next vote that they had was 1942. Rogers Hornsby was the only person elected in 1942, even though he had been retired since 1937. And they didn't vote again until 1945. But there was a problem. The writers got together again and voted in the 1945 balloting and elected no one. So 3 years had gone by. The Hall of Fame was getting going, really excited to bring in new players, and they had nobody to welcome into the doors. This created a huge backlash of criticism, one of many to come for the Hall of Fame voting process. And there were a lot of questions too, because they couldn't elect anybody about whether the writers were the right group of people to actually do the voting. The vote was immediately changed to be annual going forward to combat the lack of electees being inducted into the Hall of Fame. Now, switching gears back to the Old Timers Committee, they had met in 1939 to put those 6 players in right away from the 19th century, and they were still told to meet every year and talk about inducting more players from the 19th century, but they didn't actually get together until 1945 again. Since the Writers Ballot had elected no one in 1945, a special committee was again put together quickly to review hitters only from the 19th century and put in the best players from that time period. That included stars like Dan Brothers, Ed Delahanty, and King Kelly. The committee was supposed to meet again the following year in 1946 to look at the pitchers from the 19th century, but that didn't happen according to plan. And the reason for that is because there were a lot of tweaks to the voting process again in 1946. The Hall of Fame and Major League Baseball did this to make sure that it was easier to elect players going forward. They didn't want to have a 6-year gap with only one player being elected. What they decided to do was make the first round of voting by the writers' ballot a nomination process. So the writers were asked again to vote for 10 players, whoever they wanted to, and the top 20 vote getters from that nomination process would be moved to a second ballot, where again the writers would vote, but that time for only their 5 best players. The problem with this is that in 1946, there were still decades of great players to be looking at. And when you have the 20 best players on one list, the chances of people voting for the same 5 over and over is pretty low. So even they did this runoff process, no one got elected still in 1946, disappointing a lot of people in the industry. And a really funny point about this is all 20 players on that runoff ballot in 1946 were in the Hall of Fame by 1955. So no reason they couldn't be. Those writers just couldn't get their heads together to vote for the same people and get anybody over that 75% threshold. Now, because of this shutout again in 1946, the Old Timers Committee said, let's get together again and let's put a bunch of people in to make it easier for the writers to vote by reducing the pool of eligible players. Therefore, they elected more than just pitchers in 1946. They elected 6 pitchers and 5 more hitters. Coming into the 1947 Writers' Ballot, the Hall of Fame again put some changes into motion because they did not want a shutout again. The first thing that they did was they limited the pool of players eligible on the ballot to only those that had played in the last 25 years. This is where we start to see the evolution of the Writers' Ballot only considering recently retired players rather than players from a long time ago. The 2-ballot system was also kept in 1947, where the first ballot was a nomination process, and then 30 players would be chosen for the next ballot. Writers could still only vote for 5 players in that second balloting, the runoff ballot, but this time they changed another rule, saying that if anybody got over 75%, they would be in automatically. But if no one got over 75%, the top vote getter would automatically be elected, no matter what his percentage was. In addition to this, the pool of eligible voters was also reduced by requiring that a writer had to have a minimum of 10 years experience covering baseball before getting a vote in the writer's ballot. Before 1947, anybody covering baseball, no matter how much experience they had a vote. But because of this rule, it really restricted the newcomers and relied on writers voting that had actually seen these players play in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. Based on all of these changes, the 1947 ballot was successful. They elected 4 new players without needing the new rules around the runoff vote, including Lefty Grove, Carl Hubble, Frankie Frisch, and Mickey Cochran. As a result of that success, the Old Timers Committee decided not to meet in 1947 because they had 4 new players to include in the Hall of Fame. All of these rule changes were hugely successful for the writers' ballot, and because of that, it remained relatively unchanged between 1947 and 1955. The runoff ballot was only needed 1 time during that span in 1949, and it was ended after the 1950 balloting. The baseball writers elected 20 players over the period from 1947 to 55, a little over 2 players every year, which almost became the standard for the writers' ballot over time. Now, because of the success of the writers' ballot at electing players, the Old Timers Committee didn't really feel compelled to meet every year. And between 1947 and 1952, they only met 1 time in 1949. They elected 2 players in 1949, Kid Nichols and Mordecai Three Finger Brown. But the next year in 1953, the Hall of Fame Committee on Baseball Veterans was established. It was a committee that typically consisted of somewhere between 10 to 15 members, and it generally operated without a whole lot of changes between 1953 and up to 2001. The votes of the committee each year that it met were private. They met behind closed doors. They didn't reveal their ballots to the public, and they only let people know if somebody got in. This is the point at which we see the writers' ballot diverging from the Veterans Committee quite a bit more. Before 1953, they fed off of each other. If the writers' ballot was doing well, then the Veterans Committee didn't do anything. If the writers' ballot couldn't elect anybody, then the Veterans Committee would step up and start putting people in. But after 1953, they started to operate separately, still impacting each other, but not nearly as much as the first 2 decades. By 1956, there were more changes coming to the writers' ballot, and these changes were orchestrated because a lot of writers at the time started complaining that with so many inductees between 1936 and 1955, including 20 from the previous decade, that there weren't a whole lot of really great candidates left over. Still some good players, but not the upper echelon like it was in the first 2 decades. Because the pool of players was not as strong as it used to be, for the first time, the voters were instructed to vote for up to 10 players, not 10 players every year. The Baseball Writers Association was also instructed to only meet for balloting every 2 years on even-numbered years, while the new Veterans Committee would be meeting on odd years, so they would be alternating back and forth. And because of these new rules and instructing the writers not to vote for 10, but up to 10, the Hall of Fame did not have any inductees again in 1958 and 1960. And because the writers' ballot was only happening every other year, there were no inductees at all in those 2 years. The consensus was that the writers had just gotten really picky about who should be inducted because the rest of the guys were not Babe Ruth or Ty Cobb or Walter Johnson. But the Hall of Fame still wanted players coming in through its doors. They wanted to accept players that may not be in that cream of the crop category, but were still really great baseball players. Since the Hall of Fame was unhappy about not getting electees in 2 straight writers' ballots, they again changed the rules for 1962, and they brought back the runoff ballot. The runoff ballot would only be used in cases where a player did not gather 75% of the vote in the first balloting process. In the case that a runoff ballot had to be used, again, the top vote getter would be inducted automatically. A second new rule that was began this year was that players would only be eligible to be on the writers' ballot for the total of 15 years. Once they'd been considered for 15 years, they'd be kicked over to the Veterans Committee. And the Veterans Committee was asked to start meeting again every single year to be able to pick up the slack. For anybody who thinks that the writers were correct to try to keep the Hall of Fame just the best of the best players, I want to go through a couple players that had to wait several years to get into the Hall of Fame during this process in the late 50s and early 60s. These are guys that we consider to be top 10 players of their position, and there's no reason why the writers couldn't get some of these players into the Hall of Fame. We're talking about guys like Joe DiMaggio, who took 3 years to be able to get into the Hall of Fame. Rogers Hornsby, who got in on his 5th year. Jimmy Fox, getting in on his 6th ballot. Hank Greenberg got in finally on his 8th ballot. Dizzy Dean, the 9th year. Harry Heilman, 12th year. These are guys that should not have needed to wait so long to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. And the writers' snootiness about who deserved votes and who didn't was really inexcusable for some of these players. The runoff ballot was actually needed as well in the next couple years, 1964 and 1967. The Veterans Committee also elected 5 players and 1 manager in 1964, most likely as a result of the lack of inductees in recent years. The Veterans Committee met again in 1965, and the only inductee in that year was Pud Galvin, maybe the first PED user elected to the Hall of Fame. Since it was an odd year, there was no writer's ballot again, and so the only player being elected was a guy that had died more than 60 years ago. There was again a ton of criticism and backlash over this election class, causing the writer's ballot to start up again on an annual basis in 1966. And as a result of picking up the occurrence of the balloting process, the runoff ballot was ended in 1967 after the election of Red Ruffing. Now, the baseball writers balloting process essentially continued relatively unchanged from 1967 up to the present day. There's been some tweaks here and there, but nothing that drastically changed the process itself. The writers have been relatively good at electing players at a steady clip through that time, averaging around 2 players per year. Some years were shutouts, some had 3-4 players, but over time they have been electing players. A couple of the quick rule changes that did get implemented over that huge time period include that pretty quickly a screening committee was started in 1968 to review the players that would be put on the ballot. So prior to 1968, anybody who played 10 years would be on the ballot or could be voted for. But after 1968, they would be chosen and sent to the writers to vote for them. And it was capped at a maximum of 40 players in one ballot. Another thing that happened in the 1970s was an exception to the 5-year retirement rule when Roberto Clemente was killed in a plane crash on December 31st, 1972. He was called to be inducted into the Hall of Fame immediately in 1973, which he was. And that is where the rule was created, that a deceased player would be eligible for the Hall of Fame within a 6-month period. Next was the 5% rule, which was started in 1979. The 5% rule states that anybody who doesn't get 5% of the votes in a given ballot is not eligible to be moved forward to the next ballot, dropping off a lot of players near the bottom of the list. But that 5% rule also stated that anybody who gets 5% would have to be carried forward to the next year's ballot. Not too long after, in 1985, there was actually a group of 11 players that were added back to the writer's ballot from the 60s and 70s because they had not been carried forward prior to the 5% rule, even though they had gathered more than 5%. This group of players included guys like Dick Allen, Ken Boyer, Ron Santo, and Curt Flood. So some pretty significant players to be considered. And one last rule change in 2015, so fairly recently, the Hall of Fame instructed that players would only be eligible for the writer's ballot for 10 years of eligibility rather than the 15 that it used to be. This rule change came into effect because of the PED era and all the players that were creating a logjam on the ballot. We'll discuss this a little bit more later on. Now, while the writer's ballot continued fairly unchanged from 1967 to the present day, the Veterans Committee went through a lot more changes during that time period. In the early 1970s, Hall of Fame players Frankie Frisch and his former teammate Bill Terry were assigned to the Veterans Committee to vote on older players. And remember, this is a small group of people, around 12 at that time. Frisch and Terry started campaigning hard for their former teammates, whether they were necessarily Hall of Fame caliber players or not quite. But between 1970 and 1976, the Veterans Committee elected 25 new players and managers during that time period. This included a number of Frisch and Terry's former teammates, some of which are considered today to be some of the worst Hall of Fame inductees in the history of the game. As a direct result of this, in 1977, the committee was restricted to electing a maximum of 2 players per year going forward. Also in 1971, the Hall of Fame put together a special committee that would be examining the pre-Negro Leagues and Negro Leagues because there had been no inductees of black baseball players from that time period. This was propelled forward by Ted Williams' Hall of Fame speech when he was elected in 1967, when he specifically highlighted the careers and called for the induction of Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson. The special committee was formed in 1971 and continued to meet through 1977. Their mandate was to find the best players who had played at least 10 seasons for a Negro League team, and they elected 9 Negro League players and executives from the span of 1971 to 1977. That committee was disbanded after 1977, but going forward, the Veterans Committee was instructed to consider Negro League players as well as pre-Negro League players in conjunction with all of their Veteran Committee candidates. As a result, a slow trickle of 9 more Negro League and pre-Negro League players were inducted into the Hall of Fame between 1981 and 2001. And with that, I'm going to stop this video for today. I'm trying to make these history videos a little bit more bite-sized, so check back in a couple days and I'll finish out the history of the Baseball Hall of Fame and the voting process from about the year 2000 to where we are today. Take a moment, hit the like button on this video, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we're going to hear at least one name called later today. Todd Helton, Scott Rowland. I hope somebody gets in this year. In the meantime, keep talking baseball and we'll see you around.